Perfect. I'll let you know when we can begin. All right, when the time starts, you may begin.
Starting? Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to Fairness and Friends, a tutorial by Falaah Arif Khan, Eleni Manis, and myself, Julia Stoyanovich. We start by giving you some of our thoughts, and we will then break for questions about halfway through. After the Q&A, we will go into the second part of the presentation, and we will finish with another round of questions. If questions come up as you are listening, we strongly encourage you to use Slido, as you have been using in other tutorials, to write your questions there so that we are prepared by the time that we're going into the Q&A to bring up all of the things that interest you. So let's get started. Please take a seat and brace yourself for their holiness. Here are the tenets of fair machine learning. We expect you to follow the tenets of this guide. Be clear that there is no one correct notion of fairness, and yet feel free to propose blanket software solutions for all datasets and all applications. Be clear that ethics research is important insofar as it does not shed any bad light on the company and its products. Be clear that machine learning systems are biased when data is biased. To get an outcome that looks fair, simply train the exact same system on the biased data. Also be clear that expertise in building unethical AI is a market advantage and can be launched as ethics as a service. Please, Falaah.
Welcome to our tutorial. So as is customary with any work in fair machine learning, we first stop and ask ourselves, what do we mean by fairness? Despite what the gods have decreed in the previous slides, let's think a little more deeper. Fairness is not a statistical concept. We've co-opted fairness to mean some mathematical measure of parity, but fairness is an ethical and a philosophical concept, and a highly contested one at that. Now, deciding whether an algorithm is fair is inherently context dependent and greatly influenced by the incentives of the decision maker. Scholarship in fair machine learning has influences from law, economics, philosophy, amongst others. But even these parent fields lead to seemingly irreconcilable formulations of what a fair outcome looks like. Let's see why through a simple example. So let's take this setup inspired by the delightful 2007 Pixar film Ratatouille. Let's say we have just run a successful dinner service and we want to reward our hungry helpers with a wheel of cheese. Now, as you can see, our helpers are of different culinary experience and they hail from different rat societies. We can see that our helpers broadly fall into three groups on the basis of the culinary expertise. So Remy is our executive chef, and then we have two sous chefs and a bunch of line or rupee chefs. The decision we need to make here is how do we go about splitting that wheel of cheese amongst our chefs in a manner that is fair. Let's start by thinking like economists for a second. So if we believe that we must compensate chefs commensurate with their importance in the success of a dinner service, then we might want to give the executive chefs more cheese compared to the sous chefs, compared to the line chefs. We'll call this a utility-based allocation. The more utility you contribute towards the success of the dinner service, the more cheese you get. In order to ensure that we don't go overboard with rewarding our executive chefs, we might want to equalize the total amount of cheese that we give to any group. So we'll split the wheel into three parts and give one part to the executive chefs, one part to the sous, and one part to the line chefs, which they will then distribute amongst themselves. We could thereby argue that this utility-based distribution is equitable, and for that reason, it's fair. The political philosophers in the room could argue that the previous utility-based allocation, where the more utility you contribute, the more cheese you get, unfairly penalizes the line chefs. Now, the way that the kitchen has been set up, each line chef ends up getting less cheese purely because the kitchen needs more line chefs. An alternate allocation could be to correct for this by redistributing the extra cheese from the executive chef to the other members of the kitchen. In such a way, we've made sure that any chef that has fulfilled their responsibilities associated with their position, whether it means expertly flambeing the meats or adequately just peeling the potatoes, gets the same amount of cheese. And for that reason, this allocation could be deemed fair. Now let's stop for a second and look deeper at the construction of our kitchen. It's important for us to note that all the brown rats in our kitchen are line chefs. Structural inequalities in the rat community may have precluded certain brown rats from getting any opportunity to develop culinary expertise, leaving them with no other option than to serve as line chefs. We might want to ensure that we're also legally compliant with non-discrimination laws and we're not systematically discriminating against the brown rats night after night, giving them less cheese. See how different fairness ideals distribute cheese in a different way and end up being mutually incompatible, even in this ridiculously simple example. This leads us back to our initial question, which is what is fairness? So what is the link between our rat chefs and cheese and fair machine learning? Well, we're making a critical allocation of resources. And we have plenty fairness metrics. And our inspiration is diverse and sometimes even convoluted. But since we cannot simultaneously satisfy different fairness ideals, we urgently need some guidance about which notion to apply to which context. Maybe we can get some answers from political philosophy. Has anyone seen any political philosophers around?
Did someone say political philosophy? There is an interesting idea from philosophy that's entered the fair ML debate. It's equality of opportunity. The idea is that equality of opportunity can help us organize a taxonomy of fairness notions in machine learning. Haidari and her co-authors first raised this idea for economic models of equality of opportunity. Today, we're going to entertain how philosophers thinking about equality of opportunity can help us organize our notions of fair ML. So let's get started. Equality of opportunity is a big tent concept, like the Democratic Party in American politics. Democrats range from AOC and Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden to conservative Joe Manchin. And likewise, equality of opportunity comes in pretty conservative and pretty radical versions. But all EOP views have this in common. An EOP respecting society eliminates barriers to achievement that are irrelevant and arbitrary. That means that personal characteristics that simply don't matter in a given context, like baking skill or beauty or race or class in most employment contexts, don't improve your access to desirable positions in that context. And conversely, these characteristics don't hurt anyone's access to positions either. Marie Kondo here is telling you to throw away your irrelevant stuff so you can focus on the few things that spark relevant joy. We can immediately appreciate how equality of opportunity is a helpful lens for understanding fair ML. Think about statistical definitions of fairness. They identify protected demographic groups. Membership in these groups is irrelevant to whether a person receives a correct classification from an algorithm or a positive classification. And as a consequence, group fairness expects rough parity across protected groups for a corresponding fairness measure. Now, EOP captures this intuition. It's devoted to eliminating arbitrary barriers to achievement. If a person's race or religion or other protected group membership poses an arbitrary barrier to achievement, EOP says no. Your race, your religion, your group membership shouldn't help you or hurt you as you pursue opportunities. In this basketball game, a fair referee shouldn't be swayed by red jerseys or blue jerseys when calling fouls. And while all referees make some bad calls, we'd expect that a fair referee would get it wrong at about the same rate for red team players and blue team players. We could be talking about EOP or group fairness here. They're that similar. Speaking of similarity, EOP also reflects the intuition behind individual definitions of fairness. So individual fairness identifies a way of judging two individuals to be similar. Put another way, only irrelevant characteristics differ between similar individuals. In an individually fair world, people who are similar, i.e. people who differ only on irrelevant characteristics, should be treated similarly. And EOP gets this. If some characteristic is irrelevant to some contexts, EOP expects that differences in this irrelevant characteristic won't affect people's opportunities. If family background is irrelevant to college potential, then differences in family background shouldn't affect college admissions. To get back to basketball, if Michael Jordan and Larry Bird differ only on their team's placement in the series, an irrelevant characteristic with respect to all-star scoring titles, EOP wouldn't expect Jordan to face barriers that Bird doesn't face. Given the match between EOP and group and individual fairness, is a good lens for understanding.
Perfect. Now that we've identified equality of opportunity as an influential character in the fair ML multiverse, let's read through its origin story. It's the age of EOP. Let's stroll through EOPville, stopping by each village, meeting their mascots, and hearing them bellow out their mottos. Let's start with the libertarian. The libertarians are a deeply individualistic people, as is evidenced by the unique architectural styles of the settlements in their village on the top of your screens. Any holding of land acquired honestly without theft or cheating is claimed fair, even if it means that some people end up living lavishly in ivory towers while generations after generations of others live in dilapidated huts. Let's look at this a little more closely. So the libertarian view focuses on individuals' freedoms and liberties. So our mascot here is the Monopoly woman, whose motto to competitors is "You do you." Like in a game of Monopoly, players are free to capitalize on whatever opportunities they have access to. This could include rolling doubles and getting to move again, or picking up that revered chance card that advances you to boardwalk, provided that they gain such access fair and square. No cheating by rolling biased dice, stealing from the bank, or coercing players into making trades. All players are free to choose which property to chase. Whether they actually get the opportunity to build and develop in that spot is not entirely devoid of chance, but the game does not attempt to correct for it. Instead, the emphasis is on players' freedoms to exercise their skills of negotiation and dice throwing. For those of us who have made foes or lost friends over intense games of Monopoly, we would immediately recognize that this doesn't seem to be a form of EOP at all. There's nothing being equalized. We've included it here to clarify that contrary to scholarship in machine learning, EOP, the libertarian view of EOP is only concerned about ensuring a very limited notion of procedural fairness. Maybe then let's walk through EOPville and look at an actual version of EOP. Let's reach formal land. The Coliseum of formal EOP has its doors open to all talents. Everyone willing and able is welcome to come fight, but you compete with what you have. No special treatment once you're in. This means that even a pauper off the street is allowed to sign up, but whether he can actually put up a fight without armor or weapons of any kind against lifers who have been brought up in the gladiatorial arts since their childhood is not something the formal point of view concerns itself with. So our mascot in formal land is a certain military sergeant who advocates see nothing irrelevant, speak nothing irrelevant, hear nothing irrelevant. Formal EOP says a competition is fair when competitors are only evaluated on the basis of their relevant qualifications. This would mean that in any contest, the most qualified person wins. This is a view that rejects any qualifications that are irrelevant to the job. Hereditary privileges or social statuses, like being an aristocrat, will not get you the job. However, formal EOP makes no attempt to correct for arbitrary privileges and disadvantages that can lead to disparity between people's qualifications. Let's take an example. Because of the way that society has been set up, being a woman might preclude you from getting certain opportunities to build your qualifications. The resulting disparity in your qualifications compared to male candidates is not something the formal view seeks to correct for. Instead, the formal view emphasizes that the decision to give you the job will not be explicitly based on your gender, and to that extent will be fair. In Fair ML, formal AOP has been codified as fairness through blindness or fairness through unawareness, where any protected attributes such as sex or race or disability are deemed irrelevant and stripped from the data. The idea is that by removing sensitive attributes from the data, the algorithm will not take them into consideration when making its decision or its prediction. But we do have studies that have shown the limitation of facially fair approaches of fairness through blindness. Classifiers can infer group membership from redundantly encoded features. So say, even if we remove gender from consideration, our classifier could infer gender from attributes such as hair length and go on to systematically make decisions on the basis of this inferred gender. Does this algorithm still satisfy formal EOP?
Well, one slide back. One slide back. Thanks. Well, it may be impossible to build a genuinely gender-blind model, but yes, fairness through blindness can still pack a punch for other characteristics. Let's consider whether some personal characteristics could be successfully excluded as irrelevant. The Ban the Box campaign aims to get rid of the box on job applications that ask whether an applicant has a criminal history. The box decimates job opportunities for justice-involved individuals. Adding criminal history to the set of irrelevant characteristics when screening job candidates would be a powerful fairness measure. And that's the power of formal EOP. Likewise, in most states, employers can easily, legally perform credit checks on job applicants. And that casually excludes candidates with imperfect credit. Adding credit-related information to the set of irrelevant characteristics that aren't used to evaluate candidates is also a big fairness move. So fairness as blindness isn't as weak as it's been made out to be. There are some characteristics that can be effectively removed from the learning pipeline and make a big difference to people getting a fair look from employers and others. But formal EOP doesn't stop at fairness through blindness. It doesn't stop at recommending a list of characteristics to exclude from the learning pipeline. Suppose a test systematically underestimates individuals' qualifications in a way that tracks, say, race or money. For example, think of the SAT as a predictor of college success. When students can afford to do a lot of test prep, scores are an inflated reflection of their college potential. When students don't have access to test prep, the SAT underestimates students' college potential. So the SAT systematically overestimates more privileged students while systematically underestimating less privileged students. The test's validity as a predictor of college potential varies across groups. Now, that's a clear violation of formal EOP. After all, in the college admissions contest, applicants should only be judged by college-relevant qualifications. But this test's accuracy as a yardstick for college potential varies with students' irrelevant privilege. So formal EOP invites us to track whether a selection process is equally accurate for members of different social groups. A test whose results are systematically skewed in a way that tracks irrelevant group membership is not formal EOP compliant. And this suggests additional fairness measures for formal EOP beyond fairness as blindness. These might include measures of accuracy or test validity broken out by demographic group, or broken out by other characteristics that should be irrelevant in a given context. So to sum up, formal EOP properly understood offers strong fairness guarantees. Fairness through blindness can pack a punch if we're talking about blindness to criminal history or blindness to credit history. And formal EOP includes test accuracy and test validity compared across demographic groups. We want to see rough parity here for a formally fair test. To be clear though, formal EOP won't satisfy all of your fairness cravings. And this is going to lead us to the more substantial guarantees offered in the substantive EOP kingdoms to the south of this map. So let's take a look at these formal EOP shortcomings that might tempt us towards more substantive EOP. Formal EOP has two key shortcomings. I'm going to call them the before and the after problems. To motivate the before problem, let's remember formal EOP's basic promise, what makes it so appealing. Formal EOP promises to reward individuals for their relevant skills. It ends the aristocratic practice of including and excluding people from desirable positions based on family status or other irrelevant privileges. The thing is, formal EOP doesn't meet its own standard completely. Before competitions, formal EOP lets people use whatever privileges they have to develop competitive qualifications. So for example, formal fairness is completely satisfied in a society where any child can compete to be a warrior, but only the children of warriors get enough food and training to win the competition to be a warrior. That's Bernard Williams's famous example. To give another example of the before problem, formal EOP is completely satisfied in a world where billionaire industrialist Tony Stark can use his vast wealth to outfit Iron Man with stupendous armor. The ensuing battles can be formally fair, but the deck is stacked in favor of Iron Man. So in sum, because people can use their arbitrary, morally irrelevant privileges to prepare for formally fair competitions, these arbitrary characteristics weigh heavily on the outcomes of formally fair competitions. Formal EOP doesn't stop actual gains from being distributed along the lines of privilege and disprivilege. And this undermines its promise that only relevant skill should be rewarded. Formal EOP also has an after competition problem. After formally fair competitions, winners are set up for even more success. You win the competition for a job. Great. That leads to more training and more job experience, and it makes you more competitive in the next formal EOP competition for jobs. This snowball effect also makes losers lose faster. Suppose a formally fair algorithm evaluates you for a loan, sees your bad credit, and gives you a loan at a usurious rate, 5 million% interest. That makes it very hard to pay back the loan and easier to default. Defaulting makes your credit even worse. So the next time the formally fair algorithm takes a look at you, it'll give you an even worse loan based on your worse credit score. This is the snowball effect. Formal EOP compounds both privilege and disprivilege. Let's put together the before problem and the after problem. In the real world, outright discrimination leads some people to enjoy opportunities that are denied to others. Say, for example, in one corner of the investment banking world, women aren't offered the professional opportunities available to their male colleagues. As a result, women bankers amass fewer competitive qualifications than their male peers. They have fewer responsibilities, smaller portfolios, and slower promotions. Now, let's halt the discrimination for a moment and plunk in a formally fair competition for the job of big banking boss. Due to the before problem, formal EOP lets candidates convert their privileges into qualifications in advance of the competition. So women enter this fair competition and they tend to lose fair and square to men who have converted their privilege into qualifications. Women simply have less competitive qualifications than men on average. Now add in the snowball effect. Over time, women fall further and further behind in formally fair competitions, simply on the basis of their lesser qualifications. Now, over time, and this is the key point, gender-based differences in actual qualifications appear to explain the disparity between men and women's outcomes in investment banking. The initial discrimination against women has receded from view. Liz Anderson calls this discrimination laundering. As she puts it, with respect to racial discrimination, discrimination in on-the-job training is illegal, but discrimination on the basis of differences in human capital due to differences in on-the-job training is not. The key takeaway is that formal EOP can't fix these problems. For all of its power comes from measuring people's actual qualifications accurately and from excluding irrelevant information. The problem we've just put our finger on is that women, racial minorities, and others who face discrimination have lesser opportunities to develop qualifications. To address the problem that our society underinvests in developing the qualifications of some people, especially disadvantaged and marginalized people, we need substantive EOP. Falaah is going to take you through a tour of substantive EOP in the FAIR-ML literature. Then I'll suggest a different way of thinking about substantive EOP. But before that, let's pause for a question break.
Thank you very much, Falaah and Eleni. We have received several questions already on Slido. And for those of you who did not yet have a chance to ask a question, please submit it and we will respond to it. The first question is from Amanda. She says, I'm trying to distinguish libertarianism versus formal EOP. Is it correct to say that a libertarian might allow gender to be used in a job application, even if it's irrelevant? Falaah, please.
I can take one. So the answer to that is yes. The libertarian perspective would advocate that the same procedure be applied to men and women, but we can still take gender into account. Whereas the formal point of view would first question whether gender is relevant or not relevant to the position, and then decide whether to consider it or not. So the libertarian view is not trying to equalize anything. As long as the same procedure is being applied to all candidates, it's okay. Now, the formal point of view, which is, I think, leading to the next question, which is about what is irrelevant and what is relevant. if gender is considered relevant, it would be taken into account.
Eleni, anything to add to this? And I'll then read the next question. Okay, so the next question is by Joe, who asks, how does one define an irrelevant characteristic, in quotes? For example, SAT scores likely still have some predictive power on college performance. Does the fact that there is some way in which an irrelevant characteristic can leak in invalidate the entire characteristic? And if so, it seems really hard to get a set of truly relevant, in quotes, characteristics only. How can we address this problem? And let me go to Eleni first for this.
I'll give this a try. So in this context, the irrelevant characteristics would be something like how much money your family has. And when we say irrelevant in a philosophical context, we're talking about morally irrelevant, arbitrary. So there are some things that you might think should have no power over college admissions. One might think that, morally speaking, things like race, class, sex shouldn't have a bearing on whether you're admitted to college. That's the sense of relevance. And I realize that there's equivocation between the way relevant is used in the machine learning context and the way relevant is used in a philosophical context. So if I ever say irrelevant, think morally irrelevant, morally arbitrary. Shouldn't matter.
Falaah, anything to add?
No, I also think that question sets up the second part, which is this open question of, can we decide what is relevant, and what are the limitations to these guidances? So it also leads us to looking at how do we make the separation and so on. So we'll also answer some part of the question in the second half.
And maybe one other thing that I will add is that the key question here is how do we make this distinction about computationally relevant and morally relevant and irrelevant, and who gets to say what is morally irrelevant, right? And sort of this fight that we've been fighting as a community is to say that it's not up to one stakeholder, it's not up to just the programmer to decide which features to use and which not to use. There is a rich history, social history, philosophical history that we need to be thinking about here, of course. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir at this conference, but this is sort of the point, right? How do we align these notions? Another question here from Andrew is, who invented EOP and how has it come to be such a dominant approach in ethics and fairness? And this is for Eleni, clearly. Yes.
I invented it. So the most basic version of equality of opportunity would be formal equality of opportunity, careers open to talents. And Napoleon Bonaparte established careers open to talents. In the wake of the French Revolution, aristocratic privilege was replaced by systems of advancement on the basis of merit, right? Like competitive exams for scholarships, like the civil service as a way of getting government jobs. So when did EOP become important as a moral concept? When we moved away from aristocratic systems of privilege and towards more meritocratic and democratic systems for apportioning access to positions. That's my first pass approximation of when EOP came on the stage.
And I'm showing here a backup slide where we actually are depicting Napoleon Bonaparte. And
I think to answer like the fair ML perspective, so I think Eleni mentioned it. From the best of our knowledge, Hoda Haidari and her co-authors were the first ones to apply EOP doctrines in machine learning, but they were applying the economic perspective, the economic doctrine. So now we're giving you a philosophical grounding of how these doctrines came up, what they actually mean in philosophy, and how do we actually try to codify them.
Okay. So the next question is from Alexander, who is asking, how can we handle characteristics that are unstable or change over time? Any takers to respond to this question? Is there any philosophical guidance actually on this?
I need a little bit of information, which is when this characteristic changes, does it move from being morally relevant to morally irrelevant? I can change, suppose I I changed my gender. It's still a morally relevant characteristic. So I'm guessing what you're asking is that a characteristic might switch from being something that we want to exclude or something that we don't want to exclude. I need an example.
I would guess, based on my reading of this, is that the actual value changes of the attribute that you are measuring. Although, Eleni, your question is a very interesting one, right? When characteristics move between categories, so to say, what happens? But what would happen if someone's SAT score changed for the better or for the worse, let's say? Would there be anything that we would need to question in terms of the philosophical background here?
I don't have any guidance there.
Okay, so great question. We'll think about it. Thank you for the question. Anything else? I'm not seeing any other questions on Slido. So please don't be shy. We will be sure to leave enough time at the end of the tutorial also to once again come back to the notions that we have discussed in the first part, and of course to discuss the new material that we will present. So with this, I'm handing this back to Falaah, I believe, or Eleni. Yes.
Okay, so welcome back after a short break in the questions. So a recap of what we've seen so far. We strolled through the first half of the map. We went through Libertyville, we went through formal land. We've seen how formal EOP is codified as fairness through blindness, and how despite its shortcomings, it can actually pack a powerful punch when codified. And we've seen examples from real life, from how it's been operationalized. We've also seen the limitations of formal EOP that have motivated us to look at a more substantive point of view. So now we come to the second half of the map, which is after that little, the walls, not the Mexican wall, but the substantive wall between the two perspectives. And so now the idea of substantive EOP is that people should be provided genuine opportunities to build qualifications, so that at the point of competition, they have a fair shot at success. So we'll only look at two specific versions of substantive EOP that are particularly influential in fair machine learning. And the first one of the two is Rawls's fair EOP. So zooming into Rawls's bouncy castle. So here stay the Rawlsians in their bouncy castle of social security. And as you can see, strategically placed trampolines are abound in this castle, which means that no matter people's starting point in life, children with the same talents and willingness to use them must have the same opportunities to propel themselves up to success. So let's try to unpack that a little bit more. So the mascot for Rawlsian EOP is Rawls himself. And Rawls's fair EOP says that all people, regardless of how rich or poor they are born, should have opportunities to develop their talents, so that people with the same talents and motivation have the same educational and employment opportunities. Rawls wants to ensure that your privilege at birth doesn't snowball into a lifetime of privileges that allows you to outcompete kids whose disadvantage at birth has led to compounded disprivilege. So the motto here is equally talented babies must have equal life prospects. And the image on your screen is what we're calling Rawls and Adam, or we're calling it Rawls and Jared, Rawls and Jamal, Rawls and Karen, which is Rawls peering into the mind of a child and trying to understand their native talents and their ambitions. And the idea here is that he, after having understood a child's talents and ambitions, Rawls would like to provide them with the opportunities to build whatever qualifications they wish to build and provide them access to these developmental opportunities. So let's look at how fair ML has viewed this. So Rawls's view from the philosophical point of view is targeted at developmental opportunities, which is access to opportunities to develop qualifications from childhood onwards. But in fair machine learning, we've reinterpreted this to mean that at the point of the competition, we must measure candidates on the basis of their talents and motivation, recognizing the fact that candidates have had unequal access to build those qualifications in the first place. Now, popular codifications of Rawls's fair EOP include statistical parity from Dwork and co-authors and equality of odds from Hart and co-authors. But the idea in these codifications is that we assume that talents and motivation are equally distributed amongst subpopulations. With this assumption, and assuming that competitions are won on the basis of these talents and motivation, we would assume that subpopulations would have the same success rate as any other. Since our talents and motivations are equally distributed, and competitions measure those talents and motivations, it would be enough to ensure some sort of parity in success rates across subgroups. But if we think back to what we've told you about Rawls, about how he wants to peer into the mind of a child and set up opportunities over the course of a lifetime such that the person can build relevant qualifications, we realize that these codifications are not in the true spirit of Rawls. Because at the point where fair machine learning comes in, which is at the point where an algorithm is making a decision, it's already too late to provide people with these opportunities to build qualifications, right? So what Rawls intended to do was to provide developmental opportunities before competitions, whereas what we've codified is a measure of how equitably the competition distributes opportunities in advance of later competitions. So clearly, we've not done too well with codifying Rawls. Let's look at whether we've been able to codify a different notion of substantive EOP. The second most influential version of substantive EOP is the luck egalitarian perspective. So let's look at its settlement. So the luck egalitarians, the settlement of the luck egalitarians is the campsite on your screen where settlers are gathered around a communal fire, and they forsake all disparities in talent and effort in favor of unicorns on rainbows and outcomes that only reflect responsible choices. So let's unpack this a bit more. So the luck egalitarian thinks that Rawls doesn't go far enough in controlling for factors that provide unfair advantage or unfair disadvantage. And so the luck egalitarian says that our outcomes should only be affected by our choice luck, which is our responsible choices. No effects of brute luck, which can range from having rich parents to getting struck by lightning, should be allowed to stand. So our mascots in the luck egalitarian perspective are Dworkin and Roma, who are on your screens next to their majestic unicorn muses. So the motto of the luck egalitarian is that nothing that you did not choose for yourself should affect your life's prospects. Now, from a philosophical perspective, this seems extremely attractive because we're only measuring people on the basis of the effects of their responsible choices. But the open question here now is, how do we separate the effects of luck from the effects of responsible choices? And from a fair machine learning perspective, this is the most important question if we want to operationalize this view at all, right? So we get one particular conception of EOP, which is Romer's point of view. And this is the work that we mentioned in the Q&A, which is work by Haidari and her co-authors in codifying Romer's EOP. So the idea here is that instead of trying to split a candidate's qualifications into effects of brute luck versus effects of choice luck, we can identify certain matters of brute luck, such as race, gender, and disability, that we know affect a person's access to opportunities and their outcomes. So the idea here is that we then make a fair hiring decision by ranking candidates in their effort circumstance distribution. So this means that if we know that gender, race, and disability affect a person's ability to build qualifications, we might want to compare people with the same gender, the same race, and the same disability. And by creating this level playing field, we can then choose the best candidate from the given circumstances.
If we look closely at Romer's view, we'll see that perhaps we don't have to split a person's qualifications into a responsible effort piece and an irrelevant circumstances piece. Romer compares people only to others in similar circumstances. He's effectively controlling for irrelevant circumstances. So apples are compared to apples, oranges are compared to oranges, and bananas are ranked relative to bananas. And I got minions into the slide deck. Thank you, Falaah. This is a smart view. Romer has a really smart view. It recognizes that people's effort is affected by their circumstances. And it doesn't require the unintuitive idea that we can prize apart qualifications due to effort from qualifications due to circumstances. But Romer's view comes with a cost. It creates an apples and oranges problem. How do you compare and select among the top scoring apples and the top scoring oranges. No guidance from Romer. He doesn't provide a complete answer to the question, what would a fair ranking of candidates be? I'd argue, however, that Romer's view is uniquely intuitively appealing because it declines to make that anti-intuitive split of a person's qualifications into a responsible effort piece and an irrelevant circumstances piece. In fact, we can recast all substantive EOP views this way, and we're going to do that. But first, let me convince you that you want to bypass this distinction between responsible effort and irrelevant circumstances. So first, effort and circumstances interact. Responsible effort and arbitrary circumstances are absolutely impossible to disentangle. Imagine a child who grows up in a circus family. Those are their arbitrary circumstances. These family circumstances supply ample opportunities for the child to learn the family business. And the child has a talent for acrobatics and is motivated to practice. That's responsible effort. So the family nurtures that skill. That's lucky circumstance. So the child invests more in being an acrobat, effort, with the family's support, circumstance. Are the child's outcomes due to their family upbringing, to their circumstances? You bet. Are their outcomes due to a lot of effort? Also a resounding yes. It takes talent and a lot of practice to be a good acrobat. So effort and circumstances effects on a person's qualifications can't plausibly be prized apart. But is that so worrisome? Is it so bad that acrobat families raise acrobat kids? Is it so worrisome that farming families pass on the farming trade? I'd argue that we shouldn't really see a problem here. And I want to suggest that we only have a problem when circumstances like being born into a fabulously rich family track access to a broad range of desirable positions in a society. If your family can set you up to outcompete everyone in almost every arena, that's a kind of aristocratic capture. It indicates that your relevant skills aren't contributing meaningfully to you getting positions. Your arbitrary privilege is paving the way. Conversely, if your race impedes your ability to compete in any arena, that suggests that nobody is taking your relevant skills seriously. Your race, your arbitrary circumstances are ruling out a wide range of life paths. When arbitrary circumstances rule out or rule in a wide range of desirable positions, then we have a fairness problem. But not all circumstance effort interaction indicates unfairness that needs to be corrected. Second, there's a second reason to get substantive EOP away from splitting a person's qualifications into an effort piece and a circumstances piece that we shelve. From an employer's perspective, good hiring decisions depend on evaluating all of a person's skill, not just the part that they're properly responsible for. From a bank's perspective, good loan decisions depend on evaluating all of a person's creditworthiness. From a court's perspective, good parole decisions depend on evaluating all of a person's reoffending risk. If we insist that substantive EOP pay attention to only part of a person's qualifications, we're putting fair decision-making on a collision course with good decision-making. Employers, for example, need actually qualified candidates, not candidates who would have been qualified under different circumstances. So the further that substantive EOP's counterfactual assessment of a person's qualifications diverges from a person's actual qualifications, the less value those assessments have to employers, lenders, and decision makers. And that's the second reason to try to get away from the effort circumstances split. So let's imagine substantive EOP with Dr. Strange and without the effort circumstances split. To do this, let's put EOP views on a spectrum. To the far left, 100% straight up formal EOP views selection processes as occasions to reward existing qualifications. When you step into the 100% formal EOP arena, you compete with what you've got, and the best qualified or best performing person wins. To the far right, 100% substantive EOP focuses on individuals' opportunities to develop skills and get positions over a lifetime. So a selection process here is an occasion to equitably distribute opportunities to develop skills and qualifications. In the actual world, privilege begets more privilege, and our society underinvests in developing the qualifications of some marginalized groups. But in a 100% substantive EOP world, every hiring decision, every loan decision, every school admissions decision, and so on, is meant to invest in people's qualifications and life prospects in an equitable way. Here's a quiz. Does Dr. Strange lean towards formal or substantive EOP? Is Dr. Strange a formal guy or a substantive guy? Dr. Strange is a substantive guy. He has universal awareness. He can see the past and the future, and he sees how a decision, a hiring decision right now, provides developmental opportunities going forward, and he sees how candidates' qualifications now have been shaped by their privilege or disadvantage in the past. So Dr. Strange has many powers, including fairness. So get back to the spectrum. 100% formal EOP and 100% substantive EOP are probably undesirable extremes. In between, we have partly formal, partly substantive EOP selection processes. This part decision-making is geared partly at identifying and rewarding qualified candidates, the formal part, and partly at ensuring that our society invests equitably in developing all of its citizens' qualifications and life prospects. That's the substantive part. Let's pull the slider across to where that red dot is, almost all the way to the substantive side where the red dot is. And let's consider what a hiring decision governed mostly by substantive EOP fairness might look like. A law firm is looking for paralegals, and the firm says, practically speaking, we need people who are trained and certified paralegals. Take all the candidates who meet this bar, and then select interview candidates by lottery. And then select a diverse set of candidates that will start to remedy the demographic imbalance in this office. We're willing to consider training anyone who's good enough to be certified. This is a decision process that recognizes that this hiring decision will affect people's opportunities to develop skills and compete for positions later on. It's also a decision that recognizes that the qualifications that people bring to this moment reflect their privilege or disadvantage. The law firm is being fair while also insisting on the qualifications it needs. And the law firm can make good hiring decisions. It doesn't have to ignore some undeserved part of candidates' qualifications. We haven't split candidates' qualifications into a relevant effort piece and another piece that must be ignored. Instead, we've split the difference between a formal EOP competition and a substantive EOP distribution. So if there's a motto for this, it's don't split the person, don't split people's qualifications, split the difference between formal and substantive EOP instead. Okay, so the FAIR-ML crowd has made a big deal of impossibility results, which show that various fairness measures can't be satisfied at the same time. From a philosopher's perspective, the idea that values trade off against one another is expected. It's par for the course, no surprise, and even no big deal. Still, since it matters to the FAIR-ML audience, let's consider the kinds of EOP-based fairness views that we would absolutely expect to be in conflict, given the discussion that we've just had. The economic versions of Rawlsian and Luck egalitarian EOP, the ones that appear in the FAIR-ML literature that Falaah introduced, adjust people's qualifications to account for their undeserved circumstances. It's not surprising that these substantive EOP measures would be incompatible with formal EOP measures. We've argued that these formal EOP measures are tied to an accurate measure of people's actual qualifications, not their qualifications adjusted for circumstances. Now, if we think of the formal EOP to substantive EOP spectrum, where we've transformed substantive EOP, formal EOP rewards actual qualifications, while substantive EOP distributes developmental opportunities equitably. It's also no surprise that formal and substantive EOP would trade off against one another. These views pull in different directions, and that's okay. Some circumstances call for more formal EOP. Some call for more substantive EOP. I'm going to pass it back to Falaah to talk about how different settings might call for an emphasis on either formal EOP or substantive EOP.
Okay, so to recap the guidance that we've gotten so far, our initial problem in the Ratatouille setup was the fact that we have all of these competing ideals of what we think fairness is. And since we can't satisfy them, since we can't satisfy multiple fairness metrics in the same situation, we need some guidance about which metric to apply when, right? And so the idea of walking through EOP will is to then understand which notion or which ideal of fairness as EOP applies to which context. And so now we'll pick up, some real world examples, some fairy tale examples to sort of understand in which context, which idea of EOP is more suitable. So the first example in front of you is the idea of a fair foot race. So the problem at hand here is that we want a fair foot race in a kingdom, which means that the king's horses and the king's men can't come in riding on horses and push out all competitors that are outrunning the king. At the end of the day, it is a foot race. And as Eleni mentioned, if what we're measuring is qualifications of the past that we have built up to this point, then for a fair foot race, the fact that paupers can also run, despite not having shoes, might be enough to model a fair foot race. So in such a situation where we think that qualifications in the past are sufficient for the competition at hand, formal EOP might be enough to model a fair foot race between a stout king who probably will be slowed down by all his armor, as opposed to a pauper running barefoot on a flat plain. A more appealing perspective of formal EOP is the idea of blind auditions. So now when we worry about the fact that judges of the competition might be swayed by irrelevant traits like gender, race, appearance, we might want to use formal EOP in modeling a blind audition. So what this means is that candidates would only be judged on the basis of their singing chops. Any other qualification built up onto this point, any other characteristic that the candidate might have, such as how they look, how attractive they are, how they're dressed, how flamboyantly they behave, does not come into account for a blind audition, modeling a fair talent competition. Another example in this situation, which applies closer to the real world, is the idea of initial screenings of job applicants. So if we think that it's not sufficient, if we think that it's necessary to force employers to be blind to applicants' credit scores or their criminal convictions during initial screenings, then formal EOP is extremely powerful in this context, because we're forcing decision makers to strip irrelevant characteristics and only judge candidates on the basis of relevant qualifications that are left over. Another example here would then be if we have reason to believe that structural inequalities are precluding the fair competition. So in the example that we took before, if the king's subjects come in and start placing hurdles in the path of certain competitors, then we might want to remodel the competition to keep it fair. So the idea here is that if we have reason to believe that structural inequalities are precluding certain people from developing qualifications or running the same kind of contests, then we might want to come in and model a more substantive approach of EOP. So the idea here then would be if there are hurdles in the path of certain runners, where they're constantly jumping over hurdles throughout the course of the race, maybe we want to end up comparing the timings of smooth track runners with other smooth track runners and hurdle jumpers with other hurdle jumpers. And if you remember what we told you about Romer's EOP, this is exactly what he's doing. So the circumstance or the equalizing factor here would be the presence of hurdles, and you're comparing the timings of hurdle jumpers with other hurdle jumpers and smooth track runners with other smooth track runners. But like Eleni mentioned, what then is the right comparison between a small track runner and a hurdle jumper is not something Roma gives us guidance about. One important point to emphasize here is the fact that the substantive approach is desirable in order to ensure that we don't end up inflicting a Sisyphean struggle upon certain candidates by overlooking the disadvantage that they've had relative to their competitors. So let's say in the formal EOP Coliseum that we saw, right? We're allowing anybody off the street to come in and compete. And we're applying the same process, which is the competition applies to them all. But given the fact that people off the street have not trained in combat, or people off the street do not have armor, or people off the street do not have any amount of muscle ability, right? Formal EOP might not be sufficient to model a fair competition. And so this idea of a Sisyphean struggle leads us to look at a more broader perspective of EOP in fair machine learning as well. So the idea here is that inequalities of birth can mean that some people are just cut off from certain opportunities. And from a philosophical point of view, the equality of developmental opportunities is about making sure that people have comparable opportunities to hone talents. What matters at the end of the day, from the view of justice, is that people have genuine opportunities to realistically build qualifications and achieve their goals, and not merely formal opportunities to compete for the job. So in the example on your screen, in the context of a track and field competition, access to developmental opportunities would mean getting access to equipment, having trainers, having a coach that teaches you how to run, or that builds up your muscle definition. And think about it, no matter how natively talented one is, even if they're a chess prodigy, for example, without giving them genuine opportunities to build qualifications, we might end up having a Beth Harmon running up against an Alison Felix. And Beth Harmon in this situation might be incredibly natively talented, but she has no realistic shot at winning this opportunity, winning this competition, or even placing competitively. So this is a distinction between EOP, equality of developmental opportunities, EOP over a lifetime, and EOP at a decision point. And as we mentioned while discussing substantive EOP, fair machine learning's focus has been very narrowly towards the last one, which is EOP at a particular decision point. But we might want to broaden our horizons. It might be worth exploring fairness over the course of a lifetime, where we want to ask the question, do people have comparable, equal, or equally desirable sets of life opportunities available to them? Does EOP compound over the course of a lifetime? As Eleni mentioned, substantive EOP is a view that models the distribution of developmental opportunities. So we might want to look at this compound effect of EOP over the course of a lifetime. Or in case we're not able to model this, do we just end up snowballing a disadvantage of birth into a lifetime of disadvantage? So that essentially is the end of our EOP, is the end of our friendship with EOP. And you're probably an expert on EOP given the amount of time we spent on it by now. Are you ready to make more friends? So the next thing that we do here is look at broader notions of justice. So our stroll through EOPville has shown us a range of interpretations of fairness as EOP, but it might be worth asking the question, is fairness all that is required for an algorithm to be just? So let's look at a broader theory of justice, which is Rawls' theory of justice. So the sketch on your screen is Rawls's original position. Rawls's theory of justice sandwiches his EOP principle between two other principles that must also be satisfied for a democratic society. And he arrives at these principles via his original position. So let's look at his original position. The original position is a thought experiment about how citizens would negotiate the setup of a society under a veil of ignorance. So as you can see on your screens, we have chess pieces who have a veil of ignorance. So this means that candidates don't know their race, their class, sex, social position, or any other characteristic that might cause them to favor people like themselves during this negotiation. And the idea is that through this veil of ignorance, candidates must negotiate the setup of society. citizens here, or the chess pieces on your screen, what they do know is the rules of the game. So everybody knows the rules of the game and the conception of what success in the notion of the game looks like. But they don't know which piece they will end up being or what powers of movement and killing that are attached to that particular position. So Rawls's idea here is that the principles of social cooperation that people arrive at through such a negotiation through the veil of ignorance will be appropriate for a democratic society. This leads us to the second idea that led to Rawls's broader theory of justice, which is the natural lottery. So Rawls uses the notion of a natural lottery to describe the morally arbitrary distribution of fortune and misfortune to people. So the spectrum is broad, from Carlo to Monroe, through good looks, through talents, and family circumstances. The idea here is that from the arbitrariness of the natural lottery, Rawls arrives at his difference principle, which is our circumstances of birth are wholly arbitrary. What natural talents, what family status, what position in society we end up being born into is wholly arbitrary. So Rawls posits that we must harness this arbitrary distribution of talents in a way that generates a social system that serves everyone. So putting these two ideas together, we arrive at Rawls's broader theory of justice, which posits the following hierarchical principles. So Rawls's first principle is the principle of equal rights and liberties, which says that everyone has the same inalienable right to equal basic liberties. The second principle, which is Rawls's fair EOP, which we just discussed at length, is that all offices and positions must be open to all under conditions of fair EOP. And Rawls's third principle is the difference principle, which says that social and economic inequalities must be of the greatest benefit to the least advantage. And if you remember what we said about the natural lottery, this is how Rawls intends to harness that arbitrary nature of the distribution of talents. And so the reason why you have Rawls up on your screen in all of these provocative, fashionable poses is that in the Rawlsian system of justice, these principles are hierarchically ordered, almost like Rawls putting on a three-piece suit. Akin to how incredibly counterintuitive it would be to put on a blazer without wearing a shirt first, you can't satisfy fair EOP at the expense of a citizen's equal basic rights and liberties. Similarly, you cannot apply the difference principle in a manner that at the expense of fair EOP. And this is a helpful lens through which we can view the broader impact of algorithmic decisions beyond just satisfying that one notion of fairness as EOP. We'll take two examples to see how. So the first example is from a philosophical point of view that has nothing to do with algorithms. So let's consider the children of rich parents. If we're trying to give people equal access to developmental opportunities, one might end up preventing parents from raising kids according to their own values. Because if it's up to the parents, some kids, like those born to rich parents, would have better developmental opportunities than others. So in such a situation, when we're trying to satisfy Rawls's fair EOP, which is equality of developmental opportunities, we might end up infringing on the basic liberties of rich parents. Let's take an algorithmic perspective. So in the context of hiring of people with disabilities, let's look at how an ADS can satisfy some notion of fairness as EOP and yet go on to infringe on people's basic rights and liberties and in effect be unjust. So in the example at hand, we're looking at the fair hiring of people with disabilities. So disability, since it's protected under non-discrimination law, would be treated as a protected class, and we would not take it into explicit consideration while making a hiring decision. However, disability could be redundantly encoded in other information that the algorithm does take into account. For example, if we take social media information, the hiring algorithm could infer disability based on the person's membership in certain social groups, or in the fact that the person posts a lot about disability-related issues on social media. So then a scheme that would make hiring allocations using this inferred disability would incentivize people against joining such groups and against speaking about such topics. So the idea that fairness as EOP or that some statistical measure of fairness is enough might be reductive, or might be a reductive point of view for fair machine learning to choose to model. So in the example that we took, the algorithm could satisfy some conception of fairness as EOP, and yet it could go on to be fundamentally unjust because it would violate a candidate's basic freedom of speech and the freedom of association. Back to you, Julie.
Thank you, Falaah. So now we are nearing the conclusion. Substantive EOP seeks to provide all individuals with realistic opportunities to develop qualifications, and hence a realistic shot at competing for a broad range of positions. If we decide that the only way that we can operationalize the substantive worldview is to separate qualifications into matters of circumstance, to be controlled for, and effort that the individual can be held accountable for, then we must decide how to make this separation. For which outcomes can we hold an individual accountable? And which matters are completely out of their control? It sounds like we need a sorting hat. From a practical perspective, it is clear that we cannot separate a person's native talents from their circumstances, or their responsible choices from their brute luck. And yet we have tests like the SAT and the GRE that supposedly gauge intelligence and academic excellence and are used to make university admissions decisions. But just registering for such a test, forgetting about access to study materials and tutoring services, is prohibitively expensive. Such standardized tests do not evaluate native talent. Instead, they discriminate on the basis of social advantage and disadvantage, always. As we saw in our conversation today, equality of opportunity, or EOP doctrines, can offer us useful guidance in the design of algorithmic systems, but they also come with limitations. And overlooking these limitations can embolden their application in spheres in which theory provides little to no guidance. These doctrines do not give us any direction about where to apply fairness, in the procedure or in the outcomes. The guidance is only about how a fair test should behave. When applying this test to black box models, we run into issues of interpretability. And we can only infer details about how a test is behaving by looking at the input that the algorithm consumes, and then systematically studying the outcomes for a variety of candidates, a variety of inputs. And so the fairness, non-discrimination, justice, equality that you asked for is in this box. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this presentation, please read the Data Responsibly comic series and tell us what you think. Today's content is based on volume 2 of the series called Fairness and Friends that was released earlier this week explicitly to coincide with this tutorial. But do please also go back to see the first volume of the series called Mirror, Mirror. You may read it in English, in French, and in Spanish, and it's accessible with a screen reader in all 3 languages. We will now once again stop, and we have ample time for questions. So let's go to the questions. And we have a few already that were asked. Some of you asked where you can find additional information. So do please take a look at the comics, and we will make our slides available to you as well. And we also will be writing down a much more detailed exposition than what was in the tutorial proposal to accompany the slides and the comic. So a question from Andrew, and this was at the very beginning of the second segment, so I think that it still refers to some extent perhaps to the earlier piece. These EOP approaches seem to implicitly take for granted that social institutions like banks, prisons, courts, universities, etc., are immutable and legitimate. a good, in quotes, decision is relative to the interests of the institution, not the interests of the individual. How does EOP address illegitimacy? And yes, indeed, this is quite a general question. Eleni, please.
I think we should go back to slide 36.
Yes, let's do
That's
that.
what we're referring to.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, this is a smart question, and it's coming up partly because I was sneaky. So I was talking about good decisions for business, a bank's good decision, employer's good decision. Good can mean morally good, but here it means prudential. A good decision for a business and is one that promotes the business's interests. And I grant your implicit point, which is that organizations can have illegitimate interests, like making a ridiculous profit by preying on clients. So let me limit myself to organizations' undeniable sustainability constraints. Businesses need to make some profit, governments need to stay solvent, employers need qualified employees. If you set up substantive EOP and its justice demands in a way that's incompatible with an organization sustaining itself over time, you're in for trouble. And that's what happens if you require us to look at only the part of a person's skill that's due to their responsible effort. There's societal value in letting organizations pursue excellence and letting banks stay solvent by making good loans and letting colleges admit qualified candidates. And so we're looking for a version of substantive EOP that lets organizations, for morally good and prudentially good decision-making, make good decisions. So I hope that addresses your question. And yeah, like it happened in part because I said good, and good can mean morally good or it can mean prudentially good, and it definitely meant prudentially good.
Falaah, anything you'd like to add to this? All good. Okay.
I think that counts.
So another question we have here is from Joe, following up on the earlier answer, distinguishing formal and libertarian EOP. If gender is allowed to be used, but men and women need to be treated the same, is that not equivalent to gender not being allowed to be used?
Maybe I'll clarify the earlier answer because there seems to be like a confusion. So the libertarian perspective says the same process should be applied to both men and women. Whether the process ends up discriminating against men and women by treating them separately is not something the libertarian cares about. So the first part of the answer, which is would a libertarian EOP take gender into account? It would, because as long as you're applying the same procedure to men and women, a libertarian is okay with it. And that's the whole point that we're making here, which is there's nothing being equalized. You're not stripping any sort of discriminatory structures based on irrelevant or relevant qualifications. The second point about what formal EOP would do. So the formal perspective would argue that gender is irrelevant, so you would not consider gender. However, let's say you're creating a test that measures qualifications that just aren't accessible to women. And for some reason, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything, but let's say the GRE example, right? So let's say you're looking at the GRE score to admit students to a university. So while you're not explicitly looking at race, GRE scores might track race or might track social standing just due to the fact that access to resources or the cost of the test is extremely high, due to which candidates from certain races might, or certain races from certain areas might perform systematically worse than other candidates. So the formal point of view would say, don't look at race, but the procedure that the formal point of view is applying is systematically tracking for race, right? So the libertarian would look at race, would look at gender, look at race. The formal perspective would say, don't look at it facially, but the process might end up discriminating on the basis of race. And that's why we think substantive is a more appealing point of view here. When there are systemic inequalities that have precluded the qualifications on the basis of these characteristics. The fact that the cost of the GRE precludes candidates from certain backgrounds from having good scores, right? So I hope that answers the question. Eleni, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I want to say a little bit about libertarianism, just to background Falah's answer, which is spot on. Because I think maybe the view is being misunderstood in the FAML community. Libertarianism is the view that people have extensive rights to liberty, extensive freedom from obligations to other people. So in a libertarian world, We can't interfere with one another to distribute opportunities fairly or equitably. There are only a few rules in a libertarian society. So if I were to give you the Lockean version of libertarian society, you can't over-extract resources from the commons. You can't cheat or steal from others, only consenting transaction between consenting adults. And if the first two rules are broken, the government can step in to make things right. So if you steal my truck, the courts can step in to make me whole. EUP views suggest that there are other rules beyond these governing decisions, and libertarianism says, nope. So it's a surprise to a philosopher to hear libertarianism being evoked as an EOP view, given how bare bones libertarianism is.
Great. We have another question from Raphael that he says is more of a comment. Some organizations fully depend on finding the, in quotes, very top talent. If they were to use more substantive criteria, they would lose to competitors. I wonder how substantive principles could be incorporated without jeopardizing the survival of these organizations. Eleni, I think, yes.
I'm going to call your bluff. Organizations don't use algorithms to identify the very top talent for key executive positions. It's a very different process. It relies on the reputation of the top talented people. Sorting algorithms are used when you have 2,000 resumes and you want to hire 25 competent accountants. So interesting question, but not practically speaking, one that we need to resolve.
Right, not in this community perhaps, but if you take algorithms out of this, and at this point the boundary between algorithmic decision making and human decision making is for the most part blurred, right? And what we're looking at here is data that the applicants come with to this competition. Then I think Raphael's point is it still stands, right?
Yeah, theoretically, it's a theoretically interesting question. But what I'm saying is that practically speaking, if you're saying something like, I can't afford to do substantive EOP, I can't afford to build it into my algorithm because I really need to identify the very top talent. What I'm saying is that I suspect you're not using algorithms in the first place, because if you're looking to fill just a few spots with the very top talent, it's unlikely that you're using an algorithm. An algorithm is for people who have tons and tons of resumes and need to sort them fast.
And this is how awesome we are. We have a philosopher who actually invokes practical concerns, right?
That's right. Philosophers are really known for being practical people, right?
Exactly. Okay, so we have a few more minutes, but I don't see any more questions on Slido. We're happy to hang out here some more and to maybe chat some more. Is there anything else that Falaah or Eleni, either one of you would like to elaborate on or leave us parting thoughts for folks? Just to give people another opportunity to ask questions. If not, we can give everybody back their 10 minutes of the day. Falaah, anything you'd like to add?
Just from like the computer scientists in the room, I mean, one of the computer scientists in the room, I think the idea, like, there are a lot of open questions that still emerge from these doctrines, which it's hard. So the example of apples versus oranges, right? How do we even codify, how do we find a relevant way to compare apples to oranges is still an operational question. So how do we do this? And let's say even Rawls's emphasis on developmental opportunities, right? How do we even model that? How do we know which features that we're looking at causally affect people's qualifications that we end up looking at, right? So there are a lot of open areas for how do we operationalize this. But I think one takeaway that at least I would hope for from this is there are limitations to what these doctrines are saying, and applying them and saying that they fix the problem is solutionism, essentially. You're not solving the problem, you're creating new problems, right? So that's kind of why we also included libertarianism. Libertarianism is not a version of EOP, and it doesn't give us any guidance on how to create EOP at all, right? So I think one takeaway from here would be the questions that we're not able to answer, the questions that are still in your head about how would you codify this very much stand. So we're getting guidance about what to apply where, have some intuition of which notion of EOP philosophically is relevant in which context, but codifying it still is a very big open question that we still have to go back to work and do our work. I think that for me, that was the motivating idea. And I think that would be one takeaway that I would want participants to go.
Great, Falaah. Eleni, we have another question. So if you'd like to give some more remarks, and then we can go back to the question or whatever you prefer.
Sure. So the question is, how does EOP relate to affirmative action?
Right.
Well, as we've seen, substantive EOP is compatible with affirmative action in the sense that if you go back to the firm that's hiring paralegals, and it requires that every candidate be above a certain bar of qualifications. Beyond that, you might pursue, for example, diversity in your class. I would also say that formal EOP, when strongly applied, will help you recruit can help you recruit a more diverse class of candidates, because you're looking for a test to be valid across groups. So you don't dismiss individuals just because a test doesn't work well for their social group. But I'd be, in the first place, more inclined to say that a view that has some substantive EOP in it is looking to equitably distribute opportunities, which is compatible with the affirmative action ethos.
Great. We have one more question here. Akshay is asking, what are some alternatives to incorporate substantive EOP in FAIR-ML, apart from statistical of odds, equality of odds?
So maybe clarifying the question. So statistical parity, which was the fairness one awareness, which was inspired by Rawls, and then equality of odds, which is EOP in supervised learning by Hart and co-authors. So from the top of my head, one approach to this would be causal inference counterfactual questions, right? Because we're asking what the qualifications that a person has at this point in time. What are the underlying societal structures that precluded them from getting these qualifications or not getting these qualifications, right? So I think the counterfactual kind of fairness modeling would be a nice way to start looking at how to model the substantive point of view. And the other paper that we mentioned for the substantive point of view is the Haidari paper, which does a really good job of operationalizing Romer's EOP, but we're still left with the same question about, okay, we can rank candidates amongst others of the same circumstance, but now how do we compare candidates? So in a situation like the example that Eleni gave, which is we're trying to hire at, let's say, an entry-level position where anyway we will teach people the skills of the job, we might want to use Romer's perspective, which is diversity in hiring. So you take the best candidate amongst candidates of different races, genders, and so on. So those are some other formulations. And one approach to formulating this more principally would be like counterfactual fairness.
Great. So I'd like to actually respond also to two new questions that we just got and to respond to them together. One of them is from Joe, who says, how do we translate these ideas into machine learning systems? An ML system is blindly optimizing for some criterion, but it seems impossible to reduce these frameworks into an objective function, says Joe. And Dylan says, is there one recommendation you'd like practicing computer scientists to walk away with today? Appreciate your time and talk, and can't wait to see the comics. Thank you for the compliment, Dylan. So the reason that I would like to take these questions together is, in fact, to go back to this slide here, which in some sense is my favorite. And to me, the answer to the question of what is fair is, what can you explain? What can you make explicit? What can you make transparent? And so I think that we, as practicing data scientists and as other stakeholders in this ecosystem, as business leaders, for example, as people who are defining some of the goals for these systems, we have to think, have to step outside of this black box of machine learning systems. We do have to think about the broader societal context and other disciplines that have considered this context, and to work very hard, and it is very hard, to try and map these philosophical and social ideas into the systems that we develop. I'm more than happy, Joe and others, to also connect with all of you offline to give you pointers to some of the educational materials that we've been developing specifically for data scientists and computer scientists who are entering this field. And to Dylan's point, for me, really the biggest takeaway from this collaboration with Falaah and with Eleni has been that, and generally the work that we've been doing on the comic series has been that we really need to start thinking about these questions as people. And for that, in my mind, it's really required that we think and appreciate the humor, the discretion, the appreciation for artistic expression that we as people bring to the table and that machines simply just cannot have, right? So I think that for us all to become comfortable and productive and to form a nuanced understanding of this really, really scary area of technology ethics, we do really need to come to this with a kind of a sense of humor. And we hope that the comic book is going to bring this message home for all of you and that you will enjoy it. Yeah, so that's just my point here. Let's look at ourselves with a bit of a sense of humor, laugh at ourselves, and then relax about these problems and actually move towards solving them more productively. There's another question here. What does EOP have to say if we have adaptive behaviors as a response to historically unjust treatment? So this is Alexander, and he's the same person that asked about what happens when attributes change, right? So what he's confirming now is that it's actually to do with emergent bias, right? What do we do in situations in which the use of systems, algorithmic or otherwise, are serving to propel and to amplify results of historical discrimination? Maybe for that, I will go to the snowball slide. Is there anything else that Falaah, Eleni would like to add to this? What does EOP
I would say
say?
pull the slider in the direction of substantive EOP, right? Which is intended to get us away from only measuring people on the basis of their actual qualifications.
They can't actually find
make
the
room
slide.
for equitable treatment of people who may or may not have had the best circumstances under which to develop qualifications.
Yeah, I can't find that slide, but you'll be able to find it. The snowball. Falaah,
It's 24, Julia.
24. Thank you.
No, and I think in addition to like the snowball problem that Eleni brought up, I think that was the idea of like a broader view of fairness, which is slide 43. So we know that the outcomes of these algorithms incentivize people to behave differently than they were probably behaving at the start, right? So we know emergent biases creates like a whole set of new problems, but that's kind of why we should look at modeling EOP over a lifetime, which is like a compounded view of you gave someone a developmental opportunity, now what are their qualifications and so on later into the future, right? So that's one open area of research that we hope to identify in this work, which is how do you model the effects of the effects of providing someone a developmental opportunity or the effect of not providing someone a developmental opportunity. The fact that they might want to present themselves differently, right? So that's one open area of research that we thought would be interesting, which is to look at this life cycle view of EOP, not just at the point. And we explicitly call this out, which is fair machine learning is looking at the point of the competition, how do we hire the best candidate or what is the best decision to make. But EOP and this entire political philosophy doctrine is like a lifetime view of how society is structured, how people get access to opportunities, how they build their qualifications, what are the outcomes that they get because of those qualifications. And so I think we also need to take that broader view.
And I also want to add that in the comic, we speak in the second volume, we speak about things other than EOP. And one of the areas that we cover is Nissenbaum and Friedman's classification of bias into pre-existing, technical, and emergent. And so please take a look at that, what we have to say about that. And of course, it's much, much more difficult to deal with emergent bias. Much more difficult to detect, to say something about, right? Because we are opening the box now. The scope is much, much broader, but this truly is the challenge. We're out of time, I believe. Any closing thoughts from Falaah or Eleni? We're all good. thank you everybody for sticking with us through the hour and a half, and please be in touch. Please let us know what you think, and stay tuned for additional volumes of the comic and for more writing on what we covered here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much. Okay, thanks everybody.
Yeah, great job, everyone. We're done streaming on there, so you're
Okay,
good. That was really great. Honestly, like, yeah, it was fantastic. I mean, being a white
Thanks.
male, I mean, you don't hear these kinds of things every day, you know. And so I think it's good for. I feel like everyone should have just watched that tutorial that you just gave. Luckily, I'm from a family in a home that is like all about equality, and you know, like my parents both own companies. They would never, and they're just such good souls. They have such good souls, and they're just very good people. So I'm like really lucky that I was surrounded by that. But being able to hear some of the things that you've mentioned and touched on were awesome. Also, I'm a huge superhero nerd and book nerd too. So having all those references in there was pretty awesome. So I think you all did such a great job, and thank you so much. I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
And
Yes.
bravo, Eleni and Falaah.
Very accessible, and I mean, coming from a computer science background too, very accessible to everyone, and I think exactly in spirit with the conference.
Absolutely.
Wonderful, wonderful. So happy that you both liked it. It's good to have some live feedback, because this is like you're talking into the void, right? It's all,
Yeah.
Exactly.
yeah.
Did you notice that we all talked slow enough?
You did
I never
a
thought
great
that was even
job.
possible. We were all slow talkers.
I know. I always get feedback that I speak too quick. So you did a great job.
We worked on
Professor.
this. We actually worked on this.
Oh,
We
good.
made sure that yeah. How many people did we have? Do you know?
Do you know that?
From what I saw, probably, I mean, we'll pull up the numbers later, but probably upwards of 60,
Good.
60 something.
Good.
And people are going in between sessions. So we'll probably put out some numbers. They'll probably request them and want to share them with you guys. The tutorial chairs will probably want to share them with you guys. So, but great work, everyone.
Awesome. And I recorded your, sorry, I forgot your name. I asked you earlier.
Yeah, Morgan.
Morgan, right. I recorded your email address. I will send you a link to a PDF of the slides. And
Perfect.
I actually want to put them on the website where the comics are, so that when people get them, they also get to see the comics once again. So I'll just send you a link rather than a PDF.
So what I'll do is I'll put the link, I'll add some comments. Have you been into the community section?
Yeah, I posted actually the link to the comic there yesterday.
Okay, cool. So then that's where I would put it. There's no, I can't
So
put
I'll
it
just
back
do
into
that.
Slide. Yeah, I can't put it back into Slido, unfortunately, but
okay. So I'll just put it there, and we'll tweet it, and yeah. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sneha and Morgan. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.